Hello, I'm Pastor Todd from West Lonsdale Baptist Church, and we're so happy that you've chosen to listen to this podcast, which features this week's Sunday sermon. We hope that you find in it hope and love. We hope that if you have a relationship with Jesus, you find encouragement and growth. If you don't know Jesus, we hope that through the words that we speak on Sundays, you will find relationship with Him. Because above all else, Jesus loves you, gave His life for you, and wants relationship with you. Listen now to this week's sermon from West Lonsdale. Am I on? Nope. Yeah, there we go. I thought I'd hit the right button that time. So yeah, we're good. Thank you. Appreciate it. I thought I would start this morning just with a chance. I had told you all last week that we would try to give you a chance to ask questions. We didn't get to that. I thought I would just take a second and see if anyone had any questions from last week that y'all wanted to ask. If not, it's no big deal. It won't hurt my feelings. I've just been preparing for this moment for 12 weeks, but it's okay. I didn't want to pass up a chance for y'all to ask questions. Again, Derek, thank you so much for last week and sitting up here with me and being a part of this. Does anybody have a question that you would like to ask about anything that we discussed last week? Anyone at all? No? Oh, yeah, Dre.
I'm sorry, we had to slide just a tad bit earlier last week, but, I watch and respect you, how you approach your family, day to day, say it, but to me, you emulate what my father should be, just all around a great person. But, when knocking on death's doorstep, what do you change in your life?
Okay, so the question was, facing what I faced, as Dre put it, knocking on death's doorstep, which is accurate. It is accurate. Again, as I shared last week, my heart attack was classified as a massive heart attack. Well, not massive. If I understand it correctly, massive means catastrophic, ending in death. Thank you, Brett, for the medical input. But it was a major heart attack. How about that? It was a major heart attack. And so the question was, if having faced that, what have I now changed? What has changed in the way that I approach life and things like that? The first thing is, I don't take anything for granted. There's nothing I take for granted at this point. My time with my wife, my time with my kids, getting to do the things that I get to do, putting my hands behind my back. I didn't take that. That sounded stupid to you all. You all are probably like, yeah, what's the big deal? I've been doing that since I was 2. But just doing that without thinking, I don't take that for granted. So that's the first thing I think is I don't take anything for granted at this point. And I hope that I don't get back to where I take things for granted. I hope that I don't get back to where, little things are not as important or as big of a deal. So that's number one. Number 2 is just prioritizing. I'm really trying to prioritize what's important in life. I love you all, and I love working. I love working with Jeff. I love working with Nita. I love that. But work is not the most important thing in my life. If you know me, you know that pre-heart attack, I went 100 miles an hour, 25 hours a day. I didn't sleep much. I was on the go all the time. I ran all the time. I liked living life that way, but I was very busy, and because of that, I ignored a lot of things, from health things to family things to just a lot of things like that. And so now, just to be able, my wife and I have been going out every night. She builds a fire in a fire pit in our backyard, and we just go out there and we sit. We usually make one s'more, because I can't eat a whole s'more. And so we make one s'more and we split it, and we just kind of sit there. We don't even have to talk. We just kind of sit there. So just being together, prioritizing time with my family, prioritizing time with my wife. I told my wife, I call her my wife as if you all don't know her. I told Leanne when I was in between of having my heart attack and getting the stent and going into open heart surgery, I told Leanne, I said, when this is all done, we're going to go on a cruise. and we're going to get a balcony, and we're just going to sit there, and we're just going to watch the water go by, right? So on January 19th, Leanne and I will be boarding a cruise, and we'll be sitting on a balcony, we'll be watching the water go by. I didn't want to just talk about it. I wanted to do something about it because it was important to me that the two of us got to step away and just kind of celebrate each other. So I think not taking things for granted, prioritizing. And then I think another thing that I've changed is just my outlook on what it's going to take to be here for another 50 years. You know, diet, exercise, things like that. Not that I wasn't watching things, but now I've had to kind of take it to another level because now I'm watching sodium, I'm watching saturated fat, I'm watching carbs like I already was. I'm watching all of those things, and so I'm just trying to make sure that I do the things that I need to do to continue to be here. So some of it is mental changes, some of it's emotional changes, and some of it is physical, like changes in the way that I live life. But I think those are the things that I would say that have changed as far as because of this experience. So, does that answer your question? No, absolutely. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Dre. If for those of you who don't know, Dre's had a heart attack as well. What is it, about 5-6 years ago? Maybe longer than that? Yeah. So, anyway, what's your next question?
So fear.
Yeah.
Like how fragile. Like you really see how fragile you are.
Yes.
How are you feeling?
Okay. Yeah. So the question is fear. How am I dealing with fear? You know, and I talked a little bit about it last week, probably after you guys left, but probably not as in-depth as I should have. As my wife said, she was like, as soon as we got off stage, she was like, I wish you'd said. So this is a chance for me to say some of that. First of all, I made a statement about energy drinks last week and how bad they are for your heart. Let me say this: I've never had an energy drink. Mine was not brought on by energy drinks. All right. Matter of fact, my doctor told me that I didn't do anything to cause my heart attack. My cardiologist 100% believes that it is hereditary, that it is in our family, and we're doing some testing right now to solidify that. And she has told me over and over and over, you didn't do anything to do this. But that being said, it doesn't change the fear in your mind that little things that you do will cause it. And so last night, Leanne and I went out to eat after my soccer team played. And we got a burger and we split it, right? They don't heavily season their burgers there, so I knew there wasn't a lot of seasoning on it. I got Swiss cheese on it. Swiss cheese is low sodium cheese. By the way, in case you want to know, a slice of American cheese probably has about 280 milligrams of sodium. Slice of Swiss cheese, it's got like 50. So Swiss cheese is now my cheese of choice. It's not my favorite cheese, doesn't taste the best, but it's the best for me. So we split a burger with Swiss cheese on it, and that's what I had. My immediate thought after eating that burger was, man, this is going to kill me, right? Like, this is going to kill me. So there's that fear. There's also the fear of just overexertion, or every time you feel a pain in your chest, you're like, here it goes. One thing I didn't share last week was when I asked my doctor, like, how do I know when things need to be fixed, right? Like, how do I know when things wear out and they need to be repaired? They use the mammary artery to fix the widowmaker. It's a lifetime artery. It shouldn't wear out. But the other ones that they took out of my leg will probably at some point fail. And so I asked the question, like, how do I know? He just kind of looked at me. I said, man, am I just waiting to have another heart attack? And his medical answer was, meh. I was like, meh? What is meh? Like, so I'm just sitting around waiting to have another. So every time you feel something, you're like, oh my gosh, this is it, right? Like, this is it. I'm having the next heart attack. And that's not uncommon, because I know you felt it. I know everybody that I've talked to that's gone through this has felt it. Like, immediately your thought is, I'm going to have another one, right? Like, I'm going to have another one. And so you become a little more cautious at first in the way you do things. Like, if they said don't do this, then I'm like, okay, then I'm not going to do that. Like they said, don't lift over 10 pounds. I probably haven't lifted anything over 5 pounds since I left the hospital. Because I'm just like, I don't want to push it because I don't want to hurt myself. I don't want to do anything. So that fear is definitely there. I think the only way that you deal with it is just to kind of recognize it. Like, you have to recognize fear. Fear's there for a reason, right? Fear is there to kind of protect us and keep us safe. Some of us are overly fearful. Some of us are underly fearful. Like, I'm very fearful of heights, and I'm overly cautious of heights. And then some people, it doesn't bother them at all. I watch videos all the time of people that camp hanging off the side of a mountain. Like they put in an anchor and they put a little tent with a bed and they just hang there and sleep. And I look at that and I go, I wish that I could do that. But in reality, I'm like shaking and crying watching them do it, right? And so I think that there's such thing as a healthy fear to keep us from putting ourselves in harm's way. And then I think that there's fear that can cripple us and keep us from living life. And that's the fear that we have to say, I'm going to push through this. I'm strong. I'm strong because the Lord is in my life. I'm strong because my family's in my life. I'm strong because the doctors fixed me, right? And I have to trust that when my doctors look me in the eye, and every doctor I had has looked me in the eye and said, Todd, we fixed your heart. It's good. I have to trust that. So when that fear pops in, I have to remember that the doctor said you're good and push through that. So, but the fear is very real, and it is very crippling. And I 2 days before my heart attack, I had my annual physical, and my doctor listened to my heart and said, "Heart sounds good." Now, they can't hear blockages, so he had no idea what was going on inside there. But I remember looking at one of my nurses, my first nurse in ICU after I got moved to ICU, and saying, I just had my physical 2 days ago, and he told me my heart sounded great. Won't he be surprised? You know, like, joke's on you, Dr. Wills. Yeah, so I think that's it. The fear is real, but most of that fear is self-made, and that's the kind of fear that you just have to push through because you trust the Lord, you trust in the people that have taken care of you, and you trust in the people that surround you. So, but my wife does have nitroglycerin in her bag right now. So, in case you don't know, nitroglycerin is what you take if you think you're having a heart attack. And my wife doesn't leave the house without it, but we're planning on never using it. So, any other questions? Trey, you got any other questions? You're welcome to ask them, man. It's okay. Anybody else? Questions? Don't want to not give you a chance. All right. Well, that's enough about my story. Let's talk about your story some, right? And let's find some deep meaning in that, because when we talk about our stories, we're really talking about two components, right? There's two components to our story. One is the priority of our story, and two is the circumstances of our story, right? So the priority of our story that we're talking about is obviously our conversion with Jesus Christ. Right? Like Paul always led with that. When the Apostle Paul was telling his story in Acts 22 and Acts 26, he always led with his conversion of Jesus. But not just that. When Paul was validating himself every time, he led with some variation of, I am a child of God, right? I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a servant of God. I'm whatever the terminology was that he used. Paul always led with this idea that my life is not my own, right? My life is not my own. Now, here's the issue. In most of our lives, we experience moments, we experience time where we forget that key component. We forget that our life is not our own. And we take full authority and control of our own lives. And most of the time, when we're in a moment of denial or neglect or forgetfulness or whatever it is, we make a train wreck of things, right? Like we break it. I'm cheap. I don't like to spend money. I take that back. I like to spend money on certain things, but on most things I don't like to spend money on, right? So I'm not a mechanic at all. But every now and then when something goes wrong with the car, I think I can watch a YouTube video and I can figure this out, right? So one day, a couple of months ago, probably a year ago, something had gone wrong on our car and I decided that I could fix it. So I watched a YouTube video, ordered the part that I needed. Part came in. I watched the video again. I thought, man, that's more difficult than I remembered it. But I'm going to give it a go, right? I'm going to give it a go. And so I went and I climbed into the car. And problem number one was just getting to where I needed to be, right? So I end up upside down with my legs over the head of the seat, under the steering wheel column, with a flashlight in my mouth and the smallest screwdriver that I could find to get into this crevice to get this piece out. I finally get it out, right? I'm pouring sweat. I'm exhausted. I get out, blood's flowing to my head. I got to get up for a minute, let blood regulate itself because I'm getting dizzy. And then I go, okay, I got to go back in and put the other piece in, right? I go back in and I can't get it in quite right. So I keep messing with it. Finally, I think I get it in the way that it's supposed to be. I put the screw back in, come back out, turn it on. Now nothing works, right? Like nothing works. Before, half the car didn't cool. Now, none of the car cools, right? And I'm like, man, I have really made a mess of this. And my first thought was, well, I'll just get back in there and mess with it a little bit. And then I thought, why? Right? Like, why? I don't know what I'm doing. So why don't I take it to someone who knows what they're doing, right? So I took it to Ford, and in about 30 minutes, they fixed what I'd worked hours on, and they charged me $750 to do it. $750 for 30 minutes worth of work, and used the part that I bought. And I thought, why did I not go to work for Ford, right? I should have gone to work for Ford. I should have learned how to be a mechanic and work at Ford. No. What I took away from that was, sometimes when I try to do things that are out of my wheelhouse, I just make a mess out of it. But the people who know what they're doing, they can fix it in no time, right? So the moments in my life where I take control of my life and I take it out of God's hand, I no longer say, God, this is you in my life. I make a mess out of it. And I usually cost myself something dear, right? I usually cost myself something dear. And so Paul teaches us to recognize God's moment, God's place in our story. In reality, our story is very, very different without Jesus, right? It's like a Disney story without a hero, right? Because a Disney story without a hero is what? It's the villain winning, right? The villain wins without a hero. There has to be a hero in order for the villain to lose. And our life without Christ is tragic. It's tragic because there's no hope, right? So I want to share with you a passage out of 2 Corinthians chapter 3. This is verses 2 and 3. It says this: the only letter of recommendation we need is you yourselves. This is Paul talking to the church at Corinth, right? And Paul here is talking about the idea that he's not boasting in himself when he talks about all of the good things that God has done. He's afraid that the church of Corinth sees Paul as being prideful and boastful. So he's saying the only letter of recommendation that we need, meaning that we need, is you yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work among you, right? So then verse 3 says, clearly, You are a letter from Christ, showing the result of our ministry among you. This letter is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It is carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. Right? Paul says, listen, you are God's recommendation letter to the world. So I thought, man, I've done, as a youth pastor, as a pastor, and as a soccer coach, I've probably done, I'd say if I've done 500 letters of recommendation over 34 years, 32 years, that's probably accurate, but maybe underplaying a little bit. I do a lot of letters of recommendation. I fill them out online. I write them from scratch. I do a lot of letters of recommendation for former students, for former congregation members, for former players. I do them all the time, right? And so I thought, well, what exactly is a letter of recommendation? So I looked it up. Let me go find it here in my notes because I'm way off notes. A letter of recommendation, it turns out, is a document that provides insight into a person's character, skills, and potential. It's written by someone who knows the person well and can speak to their abilities. So our lives, according to the Apostle Paul, are recommendation letters to the world for Jesus. So what does that mean? It means that we use our lives to speak about the goodness and perfection that is found in God's character of never failing to support or save those who turn to him. That's what our stories tell people about Jesus. Why? Because we have an origin in Jesus. Why? Because we are citizens of heaven, Philippians 3:20, right? So we look at this passage, and the first thing that we see from Paul is that Paul calls on or correlates life to letter. Now, this was a big deal because letters were very important back then. This was the way that information was communicated. So letters were treated with great respect, and they were cherished possessions. If you received a personal letter, that was a massive, massive gift. One, writing utensils and writing parchment was very expensive. So if someone took the time to invest, the financial investment in sending you a personal letter, that was a big deal. That meant they cared for you deeply, or they absolutely hated you and needed you to know it, right? Like an invading army would send a letter to the king they were invading, right? That was not a letter of love, it was a letter of despise and hate, right? If I sent a personal letter to someone, it meant that they were very important to me, right? So if I'm a common person, I may not send more than 2 letters in my life. And the average person probably never sent a letter, right? It just wasn't common practice. But also, it was a way for people to communicate when they were away. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have email. They didn't have anything like that, right? We know that. They didn't even have carrier pigeons, right? That's how far back in communication we're going. I was watching an episode last night of NCIS New Orleans. I don't know if anybody watches that. I was watching an episode of NCIS New Orleans, and they were working a case, obviously, and something had happened, and they had scrambled everyone's cell phones, right? And one of the agents walks into a restaurant, and he says, "We're going to need to use your pay phone." And he walks over to the pay phone, and he opens it up, and he realizes he doesn't have any change, so he can't use the pay phone. My first thought was, why does that restaurant still have a payphone, right? Like, nobody has a payphone anymore. And then my second thought was, man, like, before cell phones, that's the way we had to communicate, right? My dad was on call 24/7. He had to be at home to receive a phone call. And if he was going somewhere, he would have to call the railroad and say, "I'm leaving, I'm going here, this is the phone number you can reach me at," right? I remember when my dad got his first pager, And we were like, freedom, right? Like we can go out to eat without having to worry about them calling because they can call him on his pager. And so communication's a big deal to us, right? How many of you in here by phone, either through text or phone call, communicate with someone in your family at least once a day? Raise your hand. At least once a day. How many of you in here by phone, either text or conversation, communicate with someone in your family at least 10 times a day? How many of you in here, I know the answer to this from some of you because I'm in the group message. How many of you in here communicate 50 to 100 times a day with family, right? 100%. I will be in a meeting and I will come out and our group message will have 75 messages in it. That's not a lie. That is not an exaggeration. Now, sometimes it's communication just through liking something or loving something or exclamating something or something like that, but like it's constant, right? Because communication is important to us. When we communicate, we feel connected. The more connected we feel, the more that we share, the deeper in the relationship that we go, right? Letters were a big deal. So when Paul says your life is a letter of recommendation, they sit up and take note because that expresses value and importance, right? So it's important to understand context, okay? So the first thing that we see is that he says, this is what your life is. It's a letter of recommendation. Now, what's the first thing that I have to ask myself about a letter? The first thing I have to ask myself is, what's the purpose of a letter? What is the purpose of a letter? It's to be read, right? Like if I write a letter, and I don't write letters, didn't write many notes in my life. I wasn't a big note writer. Didn't write notes to a lot of girls. Didn't write notes to my friends, you know. I wrote Leanne a note one time. It was we'd been dating for a year, and I wrote her a note. I think I got her a card. Gave her your stuffed monkey. Look around the computer, sweetie. Did I give you a stuffed monkey at that time? Yeah, I gave her a stuffed monkey at that time. And wrote her a note, said, no monkeying around. That was good. No monkeying around, I really like you, right? And that was my big confession at the time. I am really, really, really in like with you, right? Like, I'm really in like with you. I was terrified to say, I love you, because I didn't know if I was supposed to say that. I didn't know if it was okay to say that. Like, so I was just like, I'm going to get the point across with a monkey and a really like, right? And so I was never much of a note writer. So I don't write letters. I haven't written letters. But if I do write a letter, I would expect that whoever I write it to read it. I'd expect them not to just put it in a drawer or throw it in a fire. I would expect them to read it. I wrote a letter of resignation to Walmart one time. One Christmas, we were struggling financially a little bit, and we didn't want to not give our kids Christmas, so I went to work nights at Walmart. And I would work from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. and stocking shelves. And it was actually quite a fun job. Worked with some great people. Had a good time doing it. But when it was time to leave, I sent an email to my supervisor and just said, hey, this is my 2-week notice. We had people walk out all the time and never come back. But I was raised that you give a 2-week notice and you work it. And so I gave a 2-week notice. And kept noticing that email hadn't been open. Hadn't been open. And I told my immediate supervisor at my job that same day, I turned in my 2-week notice day, I'll only be here for 2 weeks. So I finally told them, like, hey, my email's never been opened. It's never been read by my boss, right? And I said, I don't know what to do because, like, I only have, like, 4 days left. And they've never done it. And I don't want them to think I just didn't come back. And he said, we talked about it in shift meeting. It's not a big deal, right? It's not a big deal. We talked about it. Everybody knows you're good. So I said, okay. So after my 4 days, I left and didn't go back. But it hurt my feelings that I took the time to send my boss. Everybody else just quit, right? They either got mad and stormed out during the shift, or they just didn't show back up one day or whatever. But I took the time to write my boss an email and politely tell them that I was leaving and I wouldn't be back, after 2 weeks. And they never opened it and read it. Letters are meant to be read. The letter of your life and your story is meant to be read by the people around you. But many of us keep it locked up in a box or a drawer or an envelope. And why do we do that? Paul clearly said, your life is a letter of recommendation to the world, right? Your life is a letter of recommendation to the world of who Jesus is. So why do we so many times keep our story so under lock and key? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, many of us think our story is not a story worthy of being told. We think our story is normal, ordinary, not special. And so we don't think it's worthy of being told. But Jesus tells the disciples in Mark chapter 5, verse 19, go and tell your own people how much the Lord has done for you. Go and tell your own people, the people who know you best, the people who know your life, the people who recognize your ups and downs, the people who know where you've been and know what you've been through and all of these things. Go tell them your story and let your life speak of God's ability to save, of God's ability to provide, of God's ability to bring comfort, of God's ability to heal. Go let your life speak to them, the people who know you best and you can't hide from. When I was younger in ministry, I felt the need to almost sensationalize my gospel story, right? My Jesus story. I felt when I was standing in front of a crowd of teenagers that maybe I needed to overinflate certain things, right? Because I was looking for spiritual street credibility. Like I was looking for spiritual street cred. I wanted to look at me and go, man, that's an awesome story. Like when I hear some of the guys, like when I hear David Nasser tell his story of escaping Iran during the Iranian Revolution, and I hear about him leaving as a Muslim, and I hear about his story of coming to Texas as an Iranian Muslim during the Iranian hostage crisis and living out life in Texas as an Iranian Muslim during that time. And I hear him talk about finding Jesus. I'm like, man, that's an amazing story, right? When I listen to Tony Nolan's story about the abuse that he went through in all of the homes that he was passed around to as an orphan and an abandoned child, and I hear about the abuse that he suffered and all of those things that he went through only to find Jesus, I'm like, man, that's an incredible, incredible story. And if I'm going to reach teenagers like those guys reach teenagers, then I have to have that story, right? And so I found myself sensationalizing maybe a little bit, right? Like maybe overplaying parts that shouldn't have been overplayed as much. Like maybe highlighting the bad areas of my life more than I should have. Maybe saying something was worse than it really was, And I found myself saying, what did I know? I was an 18-year-old youth pastor. I had just graduated. I was on the football team with some of the guys that I was youth pastoring 6 months earlier, right? We shared the same locker room, shared the same classrooms. I'd been friends with people that I was now the youth pastor of my entire life, right? Then I left and went to another church. I wanted to be cool, right? I wanted to be the cool youth pastor. So I'm like, I got to tell good stories, right? So I became a storyteller and I began to tell stories about myself. But you know who I couldn't do that to? My own people. Because they knew me best. So what did Jesus tell the disciples early in their story developing process? Go tell your story to your own people. Why? Because you can't hide anything from them. You got to tell your story. In reality, I want you to get used to that. Jesus is preparing the disciples to tell their story in full honesty and full truth. Because your story's good enough. It's good enough. You don't need the big wow moment. Your big wow moment is Jesus found me and saved me. That's the big wow moment. And it doesn't matter if you're the best person that ever lived. You could be. I don't know. It's hard pressed because my mom and Vicky have lived. And they're both as close to perfect as you're going to find, right? Close to perfect as you're going to find. My dad and Vic, not as much. My mom and Vicky, right there. God's next door neighbor in heaven, right? Their story of meeting Jesus is just as powerful, if not more so, than the story of Dave Nasser or the story of Tony Nolan or the story of Jay Strack. If you've never heard Jay Strack's story, if you get on YouTube at all, I don't know that you'll find this immediately. You may have to look a little bit, and if I find it, I'll give you the address or I'll give you the link. Look up Jay Strack testimony. His testimony is riveting, one, but tragic, two, right? This is a guy that never had a chance, and yet has been the spiritual advisors to presidents, Fortune 500 owners, generational pastors, youth pastors. Check out his story. It's riveting, right? But your story, just as powerful. Why? Because Jesus didn't have to chase you through the muck and the mire and the fear and the separation and the isolation and the destruction. For some of you, Jesus found you in the good times. And yet you still said, I need Jesus. I need Jesus. And so the idea of telling people our story, people we know or people we don't know, terrifies us because we don't want people to know us, right? We want people to know the us that we want to project, but not know us. And when we get down to our story about Jesus, people have to get to know us. And we're terrified that the true us and the us that we project won't match when people begin to really know our story. Because we like to project confidence, we like to project success, we like to project comfortability, we like to project all of these things, right? It's why social media is so deceptive. Because we are able to show the best parts, right? We show people what we want. That's why I love the videos that are like perception versus reality. On social media, it's like, hey, this is what you saw, but this is what we had to do to get there, right? And this is what we had to go through. And many of us, our lives reflect social media, even though we maybe don't even know what social media is. We project something to people, and in reality, we see ourselves a completely different way. And we're terrified that those two worlds are going to collide one day and people are going to see us as something that we don't want them to see us as. Paul says in Romans chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Oh, what a miserable person I am. Have you ever thought that about yourself? Oh, what a miserable person I am. Like, I'm just the worst. I'm the worst, right? You miss somebody's birthday? I'm the worst. Right? You didn't get your wife something for her anniversary, for your anniversary? I'm just the worst, right? You didn't finish a project at work? I'm just the worst. You didn't do your part on a group project? I'm the worst, right? You're running late to work? I'm the worst. I'm miserable. I am a miserable person, right? Oh, miserable me. Paul is not saying there, when he says, oh, what a miserable person I am, he's not saying, oh, I just hate life. He's saying, I'm the worst, right? I am the worst kind of person. Who will free me from this sin that dominates my life and leads to death? He answers his own question. He says, thank God. The answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. I'm the worst, but it's okay because I know Jesus. You know what that tells me? It's okay for my story to not be perfect, as long as it's rooted in Jesus. as long as it's rooted in Jesus. And so that letter of recommendation that we have, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3, that your life is a letter of recommendation, not a letter written in ink or on paper, but through the Spirit and on our heart. So that tells me this. It tells me that your story is not, it's not changeable in so much that Jesus can't leave us, won't walk away from us, doesn't drop us. That it's not temporary, that it's not corruptible, but instead it's grounded in the Spirit and written on our hearts, right? If I write a letter, I can erase, I can throw it away, I can burn it, I can do any of that and get rid of it. And I could be writing one letter and I can say, no, that doesn't sound good, throw it away and write a completely different letter, right? Like I say, oh, that sounds too depressing, and I can write a happy letter. Or I can say, oh, that gives too much information, and I can write a letter that's less informative, right? But our story is a story that's written on our heart in the Spirit, and it's unchangeable. Its foundation is in truth, and it's real. And it says many things about us. It says that we recognized our frailty. We recognized our lostness. We recognized our need for revival. And we found it in Jesus. So when we go to share our story, what should we say? What's important? I mean, sometimes we get lost in telling a story, right? I'm a pretty decent storyteller. It's what I do for a living. I'm not a great joke teller. I get lost in the details of jokes sometimes, and they don't come across as funny, right? I'm my funniest when I'm not telling a joke, usually when I'm making fun of myself. But when I tell a joke, I get lost in the details sometimes, and it doesn't come out the way that it should. And many of us are that way with stories, right? Like, I'm just not a storyteller. I can't talk to people. I can't. And we get worried that if I start telling people about Jesus, I'm just going to get lost in the details. I'm not going to get the important things out. So what are the important things that I should say so that I don't trip over myself and I don't get lost whenever I'm telling my story? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that you tell your story without speaking most of the time. You tell your story without speaking. And it's either a story of, I believe in Jesus, but I don't trust him, because I live my life fully in control of it by myself. Or I believe in Jesus and I trust him fully, and you know it by the way that I live my life. But if I'm physically telling someone my story, what's important? How do I get lost so that people don't have to fill in the blank on their own? Well, the first thing is that you make sure that Jesus is the hero always. Paul always made sure Jesus was the hero. Peter always made sure that Jesus was the hero. When Paul and Peter tell their stories in the New Testament, they always make sure that it starts and ends with Jesus. There is no other outcome without Jesus. Jesus is the outcome. He is the hero. So make sure that Jesus is the hero. You didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. I tell people all the time when I'm telling my story, then I turned and I walked down the aisle and the pastor took me by the hand. I didn't even do that much, because I got up to go right and go out the back door and go to Bel Air Grill and make a reservation. And Jesus turned me left and brought me to the aisle. I can't even take ownership of that. I had a different plan. Jesus is the hero of our story, always. So you don't have to make it out that you did anything special. Make sure they know Jesus is the hero. Make sure that you always express hope. You always express hope. Even in my darkest, Jesus was there. Even in my darkest moments, Jesus is there. Because our story is not just, the climax of our story is finding Jesus, right? But we have chapters that are written after that, right? Like a chapter in my story is what I've gone through over the last almost 13 weeks now, right? Really longer than that, because I was experiencing things, as I told you last week, before that. But that's a chapter in my story. And so even in that chapter, I try to tell people that even in my darkest moments, I wasn't worried. I knew that Jesus was in charge. I knew that Jesus was in control. I didn't know what that looked like. As I told you guys last week, I honestly didn't know that I was going to come out of my surgery. I honestly didn't know that. I had people telling me, oh, God's not done with you. He's so good. God's not done with you. He's got so much work to do still through you. And you know what my response? I told my wife this the night before surgery when we were having our big heart-to-heart. I said, I don't know, Leanne. I said, people keep telling me God's not done with you. He's still got so much to do with you. And then I said this, but does God accomplish more through me coming out of this, or does he accomplish more by me not coming out of this? And I looked at her and I said, it's okay. Whatever happens, it's okay. I honestly was at peace. Now, my legs weren't at peace the next morning because they were shaking like crazy. Fear was there, but hope was also there, right? So we always have to make sure that we express hope. We always have to make sure that people know that God is a God of hope and a God of love, and even in our darkest times. Why? Because people live in dark times. Most of us probably spend the majority of our time in dark times. Not the greatest of times. We don't feel great. Things aren't great at work. Things aren't great at home. Things aren't great at school. Things aren't great on the team. Things aren't great in our mind. Things aren't great in our health. Most of us live our lives in darker times. Maybe not the darkest of times, but not the brightest of times, right? But Jesus is always giving us hope. So make sure that we express hope. We also need to make sure that we tell our people. Make sure that the people closest to you know you and know your story in Jesus. Your story is the most powerful tool that you own for spreading the gospel of Jesus. Make sure you're telling it to the people closest to you. Going across the world and serving underprivileged people in parts of Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and all across America. That is noble and fantastic and worthy of your effort. But don't get in a car, a bus, a plane, a boat, and go do it for somebody else if you haven't done it for the people closest to you. Jesus told the disciples, go tell your people. Go tell your people. Lastly, make sure to remember that your story is the gospel in real time. That's a more powerful statement than it sounds like. Most people, when they read the Bible, they think, yeah, but that was so long ago. Things are so different now. Things are so different now, right? Like what Jesus did, it wouldn't work in this world today. You couldn't do the things he said, say the things he did, or do the things he did, say the things he said, live the life that he lived. You couldn't do that in today's society. Today's society wouldn't deal with it, right? They wouldn't put up with it. Jesus would be controversial. He would be canceled, right? Like he couldn't be effective in this world today. Your life is the gospel in real time. Your life is Jesus' work in today's world, right? So you need to make sure that people remember that your story is the gospel in real time, in this moment, in this life, in this world. Why is that important? Because Jesus does still matter. And Jesus is still important. And Jesus is still relevant. And Jesus can still reach people in this world. And Jesus can still change lives. And he can still save the desperate as well as the comfortable. People need to be reminded of that. Jesus is not outdated. He is forever. Scripture says he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? And a skeptic would say that's the problem. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But this world changes. No. This world does not change. Get that right. Get that straight. This world does not change. The way that we present our problems changes. But the problems are the same. The same problems that Jesus was dealing with were the same problems that Moses dealt with, were the same problems that Adam dealt with, were the same problems that your great-grandparents dealt with, the same problems that we deal with, and the same problems that our great-great-great-great-grandchildren will deal with in the year 3000. That's a Jonas Brothers reference. Some of you got it, some of you didn't. It's okay. It means a lot to me. Jesus is the same. Our problems are the same. The vehicle with which we experience those problems changes. Right? I'm in closing because I don't want to go way over again today. Dylan and I were driving the other day and we were talking about we were talking about my mom and how my mom grew up. And my mom grew up in Sevier County, and she grew up on a farm. She's a tobacco farmer. And we were talking about some of that. Was that the conversation we were having, Dylan, when you said, I think I would have enjoyed living back then, right? He said, I think I would have enjoyed living back then. Just, I think it would have been nice, you know? And my response was, well, it depends. Like, living then, you know, living in you know, back in settlement of the U.S. or, you know, the Revolutionary period or anything, I think it'd be great. I'm a history guy. I think it'd be great as long as I did it not knowing what I know today, right? I'd have a hard time going out and pumping my own water to carry it into the house so that I could, you know, boil it so that I could cook something. And some of you are going, that's my childhood, Todd. I get that. I would have a hard time doing that knowing that I lived in a world where I could just walk in and turn the faucet on, right? That'd be difficult for me to deal with. But if I didn't know any better, I think it would be kind of cool. I think it would be fun. I think the Revolutionary period would have been amazing to live in. It's my favorite period in history. I think it would have been amazing to live in, right? And in talking about that, I came to realize how unique all of our stories are, but yet how similar they are at the same time. They all contain the same components. They all contain tragedy. They all contain success. They all contain love. They all contain heartbreak. They all contain opportunity. And they all contain failure. But if you find yourself as a citizen of heaven, then they all contain the most important aspect, which is life intersecting with Jesus. Life intersecting with Jesus. That's what your story's about. And that's why we should be publishing our story at will to the world around us. Not hiding it, ashamed of the story that we've written. If you've got massive failure in your life, if you've got massive destruction in your life, if you've got massive regret in your life, but you found Jesus, it's okay for people to read that story. It doesn't reflect on you, it reflects on God's goodness and His ability to overcome and His ability to see us all the same and love us anyway. And if you don't, you only have success in your life. You only have goodness in your life. You only have pleasure in your life. You only have that success in your life. And then you find Jesus, it's okay for people to read that story. Because it reflects God's goodness and God's ability to have parity among all of us. And to see sin for what it is. Brokenness and separation from God. And whether it is what we would classify as small sin or whether we would classify as great sin, God sees it the same. I joke about Vicky and my mom all the time. They have sin in their life. It's not major sin, but it's sin. And God has forgiven them for it. There's a man in New York, his name is John Kaji. If you've been to New York with us, you've heard John's testimony. You know what I'm about to say. John Kaji in Nepal stabbed a man and left him lying in the front yard to die and fled the country. He was a bad man. Everyone around feared him in Nepal where he lived. They feared him. He came to America and he found Jesus. And he has the sweetest personality, sweetest disposition. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. When I walk around New York with John, I feel a lot safer. I'm like, I'm good, right? Because John will stab them to death if he needs to. Sweetest guy in the world, right? Takes these funny selfies everywhere in New York and posts them on social media. His story of salvation and redemption in Jesus, just as powerful as Vicky's. Just as powerful as my mom's. Because Jesus never fails. He never fails. And if your life has intersected with Jesus, then you have a story worth telling. So go tell it. I kind of like sitting here and preaching. It's kind of comfortable. I feel like we're just talking. Let's pray this morning. Jesus, we love you. God, we thank you for hope and salvation and promise and goodness. Lord, we thank you for writing a story in our life, for telling us, Jesus, of your great love for us. And then, Lord, for allowing us to be a letter of recommendation for you, Lord. I take great pride in writing letters of recommendation for people that I know and love, Jesus. And so the thought that I could be a letter of recommendation for you, God, is something special. So, Lord, may I embrace that? May I live it out? God, I ask two things this morning. One, I ask that if there's anyone here that their life hasn't intersected with you, that this morning would be their intersection point. It would be their meeting point, Jesus, and that they would come to know you in fullness and in love this morning. God, that they would recognize their own sins, own failures, and ask you to forgive them and be Lord of their life. Jesus, number two, my request is this, for all of us to evaluate how we tell our stories. Are we telling an accurate story? Are we telling our story at all? Or are we projecting something untrue? And then Jesus, that this morning we would decide, Lord, I will be a biography for Jesus every day, willing to be written and spoken about him. Lord, may my autobiography be more about you than it is about me. And Lord, this morning, that makes it a successful morning. So Jesus, we love you. We ask that you be with us now. In your name we pray. Amen. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us on the podcast this week as we dissected God's Word from our Sunday sermon. If you would like to hear more, you have an opportunity to listen to a follow-up podcast that I do with Luke Daly called After the Sermon, where we take aspects of this week's message and we just go a little bit deeper. Maybe we broaden the discussion, maybe we dive into some new scripture, maybe we look at some new aspects of it. We'd love for you to check that out. You can find it right here on this same podcast page, After the Sermon, with myself, Todd Halliburton, and Luke Daly. Again, thank you for listening, and we hope that you have relationship with Jesus. If you don't, he wants relationship with you more than anything. We'd love to help you out. You can find contact information for us right here on the West Lonsdale website, westlonsdale.org. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see you on Sundays if you're in the Knoxville area and don't have a church home. Worship every week at 10:15. Thanks again for listening.